Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. If you love feeling your heart race and the suspense creeping into the room, you're in the right place. But before we begin, I have an invitation for you. If you truly have the courage to face the unknown, go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Share this video with someone who also loves the thrill of fear, but be careful. The scariest things tend to happen when you least expect it. Are you ready to face what's coming next? Let's see if you can handle it. It was a cold night in 1947 when 5 political prisoners, men accused of betraying the state, were taken to an underground military installation. General Volkov, a man known for his lack of scruples, led the project with the promise of delivering revolutionary results. "We want to understand how the human mind reacts to extremes," he said, as he watched prisoners being locked in an airtight chamber. The promise was simple. Whoever survived 15 days without sleeping would be released. Scientists introduced the special gas into the chamber, observing the initial reactions. At first, the prisoners laughed, talked, and even joked about their situation. The gas, without odor or taste, seemed to have no immediate effect. However, as the hours passed, signs of unrest began to appear. The men's eyelids trembled as they struggled to keep their eyes open. But, to the scientists' surprise, they didn't sleep. "Observe the behavior," said Dr. Dmitri, one of the leading scientists. "This will reveal the secrets of sleep deprivation." But he didn't know that the secrets that were about to be revealed were much darker than any scientific study could predict. On the 4th day of the experiment, the changes were undeniable. The prisoners, who had previously been talking in a friendly manner, now began to shout for no apparent reason. One of them, Ivan, began to walk in circles, muttering about shadows he observed on the walls of the chamber. The other men's screams echoed through the facility, but the scientists, intrigued, did not intervene. "It's an expected phase of sleep deprivation," said Dr. Dmitri. "They'll get over it." But as the days passed, the screams became more disturbing. One of the prisoners, Alexei, began scratching the walls with his nails, tearing pieces of flesh from his hands, while his eyes glazed over, as if he saw something that no one else could see. "They're coming! They're watching us!" he screamed, over and over. Scientists began to realize that something was terribly wrong, but General Volkov ordered the experiment to continue. "Let's see how far they can go," he said coldly. The madness they would witness over the next few hours would surpass all imaginable limits. By the end of the 6th day, the chamber was in complete chaos. The prisoners had stopped communicating with the scientists, and all that could be heard were disturbing sounds. Maniacal laughter, screams of pain, and heavy, ragged breathing that seemed to come from every corner of the chamber. When the scientists finally turned on the microphones to see what was happening, they heard a sound they would never forget. It was the sound of flesh being ripped apart. The observation cameras showed an unimaginable scene. 2 of the prisoners had brutally attacked one of their companions, devouring parts of his body like wild animals. The horror in the scientists' eyes was palpable, but Volkov ordered them not to stop the experiment. "They are turning into something more," he said, with a disturbing coldness. "We need to see where this goes." However, something more sinister was happening. The other prisoners seemed indifferent to the cannibalism taking place before them. They were changing physically and mentally. Their once human faces began to contort into blank expressions, without any trace of sanity. It was as if something else was taking over their bodies. On the 9th day, scientists finally decided to intervene. The condition of the prisoners was alarming. 2 of them were completely mutilated, while the other 3 seemed to be on the verge of a terrifying metamorphosis. When the gas was temporarily turned off to open the chamber, the prisoners began to scream frantically, begging for the gas to be turned back on. "Don't make us sleep," one of them shouted. "Please, we need to stay awake." The scientists hesitated. The men's pleas made no sense. Sleep was the only thing that could save them, right? But the prisoners seemed terrified at the thought of sleep. When the doors of the chamber opened, the prisoners charged like wild animals, attacking the soldiers who tried to restrain them. One of the prisoners, who seemed the calmest, ripped off his own skin before lunging at one of the guards. laughing like a devil as he did so. Finally, after a brutal fight, the remaining prisoners were sedated and restrained, but what was inside them was no longer human. The sedated prisoners were strapped onto stretchers while scientists tried to understand what had happened. Dr. Dmitri, now deeply regretting having allowed the experiment to continue, watched the monitoring screens as the prisoners writhed in their beds, muttering incoherent sentences. "They're awake," whispered one of the assistants. "Even though they're sedated, they're still awake." It was true. The prisoners, although immobilized by sedatives, kept their eyes wide open, unable to close their eyelids. Their breathing was irregular, and the murmurs intensified by the hour. "We are not us anymore," said one of them, in a guttural voice. "Are you?" These words echoed in the minds of scientists. What did this mean? Had the prisoners completely lost their identities? Or was something more sinister at play? General Volkov, in turn, continued to insist that the experiment must be completed. "We are on the verge of a revolutionary discovery," he said, although his eyes betrayed a fear he would not admit. But no one knew where that discovery would take them. On the 11th day, the prisoners' condition became even more bizarre. Not only did they resist the sedatives, they seemed to be becoming something more. Their bodies, once fragile from lack of sleep, now seemed strangely strong, their veins pulsing beneath their skeletal skin. It was as if the gas was turning them into flesh and blood monsters. The scientists, who had previously watched in fascination, were now terrified. Dr. Dmitri, once firm in his belief in science, began to doubt his own sanity. "What did we do?" he whispered to himself. Volkov, however, remained obsessed, insisting that the experiment needed to continue until the end. One of the prisoners, who had been quiet before, finally broke his silence. He began laughing uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror and elation. "They're here," he shouted. "The shadows, they are on us. We can't go back." And then, with a sudden movement, he freed himself from his bonds, throwing his body against the wall, cracking his skull and laughing until his last breath. On the 15th day, only 2 prisoners remained alive, but they were no longer the men who had entered the chamber. They were no longer the men who had entered the chamber. Their bodies were torn apart, but they showed no pain. Their voices, now distorted, echoed throughout the laboratory, as if something inhuman was speaking through them. "We are you," they repeated. On the 15th day, only 2 prisoners remained alive, but they were no longer the men who had entered the chamber. Their bodies were torn apart, but they showed no pain. Their voices, now distorted, echoed throughout the laboratory, as if something inhuman was speaking through them. "We are you," they repeated in unison, their eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on the surveillance cameras. Dr. Dmitri watched in shock. "That's not possible," he muttered, unable to understand how those mutilated bodies could still speak. The gas had done more than just deprive them of sleep. It seemed to have brought to the surface a hidden force, something that had always been within them, but that sleep had suppressed. "What did we do?" he wondered aloud, as the prisoners continued to mutter meaningless phrases but full of terrible truth. General Volkov, despite his initial coolness, was beginning to show signs of restlessness. "We can still learn from this," he insisted, though his voice betrayed fear. The remaining prisoners, now unrecognizable, seemed to be on the verge of a new transformation. Something else was about to emerge, something that didn't belong in this world. That same day, a decision was made. The experiment would be stopped. The scientists, led by Dr. Dmitri, decided that the only way to end the nightmare was to remove the prisoners from the chamber and, if necessary, dispose of them. But when they entered the enclosure, the 2 remaining prisoners did not resist. They simply smiled, as if they knew the end was near, but it wasn't their end. "Why are you smiling?" asked one of the guards, his hand shaking as he gripped the gun. The most mutilated prisoner, his eyes completely lifeless, replied calmly, "Because you already know what we are." Before anyone could react, he threw himself against the wall, hitting his head repeatedly while laughing hysterically. They weren't trying to escape. They were giving themselves away. The other prisoner, in a calmer voice, whispered, "We are not the first, and you will not be the last either." His words were the last thing he said before succumbing to his injuries. The laboratory, which was once a symbol of scientific progress, was now bathed in dead silence. But his words kept echoing in everyone's minds. "You won't be the last either." The prisoners' bodies were removed, but the atmosphere in the laboratory had changed forever. The experiment was officially over, but the psychological impact on the scientists was evident. Many resigned immediately, while others disappeared without a trace in the following days. No one wanted to talk about what had happened. It was as if knowledge of the experiment itself was a curse. Dr. Dmitri, however, could not let go of what he had witnessed. Deep down, he knew there was something beyond science in that chamber, something he couldn't fully understand. Determined to uncover the truth, he began investigating old records of similar experiments conducted by the Soviet government. What he found was even more disturbing. Secret documents dating back decades revealed that this was not the first experiment with sleep deprivation. Other attempts had been made, always ending in catastrophic results. But there was a connection that no one had noticed. The gas used in the experiment was not a simple chemical mixture. It was a compound developed based on arcane rituals, designed to awaken a hidden part of the human mind, a part that should remain dormant. Upon investigating further, Dr. Dmitri found a recurring name in the ancient documents, the sleepless beast. It was a dark legend that dated back to ancient tribes who believed that sleep was not just a physical necessity, but a protection against something much deeper. For these cultures, depriving oneself of sleep for too long not only meant physical death, but the release of an entity trapped within each person, something that wanted to consume everything around it. The prisoner's last words made sense now. "We are you." They were no longer human, but rather manifestations of this entity that lived within them, something that sleep kept in chains. When deprived of sleep long enough, their bodies had transformed into vehicles for this entity, a being that existed in a state between life and death. Dr. Dmitri knew that this truth could never be revealed to the world. If it were, panic would take over humanity. Who could sleep peacefully knowing that something so terrible lived inside each of us? The days after the experiment ended were dark. The laboratory was sealed and records of the experiment were officially destroyed. However, Dr. Dmitri could not erase the image of the prisoners from his mind. The experiment may be over, but the terror it awakened was just beginning to manifest itself in his life. One sleepless night, tormented by the events he had witnessed, Dmitri had a terrifyingly real dream. He was back in the chamber watching the prisoners. They were standing, looking directly at him. "You freed us," one of them said, in a strangely familiar voice. When Dmitri woke up, his room was shrouded in oppressive darkness. He felt a presence, a shadow in the corner of the room, watching him. The thing inside him was waking up. The following nights were increasingly worse. What was once mild insomnia turned into constant torment. Dmitri couldn't sleep. His eyes would stay open for hours, the fear of closing his eyes greater than the exhaustion. He began to hear whispers, first distant, then close. "We are you." Dr. Dmitri was on the verge of collapse. He spent days and nights in the old laboratory, reliving the moments of the experiment, trying to find answers to what had happened. The whispers grew louder every day, and the prisoners' faces appeared in his nightmares, watching him, waiting for him to finally succumb. One night, while leafing through old reports, Dmitri discovered something that made him freeze. A secret order had been issued to continue the experiments, not only in the Soviet Union, but in other countries as well. Scientists around the world were conducting similar tests, all trying to understand the hidden potential of the human mind. What they didn't know, or maybe they did know, was that they were opening the door to something beyond their understanding. Dmitri realized that the world was in danger. If the entities released by the prisoners were awakened in more people, it would be the end of humanity as we knew it. He needed to stop the experiments before it was too late. Determined to stop the terror of lost sleep from spreading, Dmitri began contacting other scientists involved in the project. However, many of them had already mysteriously disappeared or been silenced by the government. Those who were still alive were tormented by the same nightmares as him. "They're coming for us," one of them said, before hanging up the phone abruptly. With time running against him, Dmitri formulated a desperate plan. He would destroy the laboratory and all remaining records. It was the only way to guarantee that no one else would try to repeat the experiment. But as he prepared everything, the whispers became more intense. The entity within him was gaining strength. "You can't stop us," whispered the voice, as he worked feverishly to erase all traces of the experiment. "We're awake now, you two." The night Dmitri planned to destroy the laboratory, something changed. He was about to set off the explosives when he felt a sharp pain in his head, as if something was trying to escape from inside his skull. He fell to his knees, screaming in pain. "I won't let you leave," he shouted, trying to resist the force that dominated him. But the voices inside his mind were getting stronger, and his body was no longer responding. His eyes began to burn, and his vision blurred. The entity was taking control. Dmitri looked into the mirror and saw his distorted reflection, a monstrous version of himself. "We are you," said the voice, and for the first time, Dmitri believed it. With the last of his strength, he tried to reach the detonator. If he could destroy the lab, maybe he could end it all. But the entity was faster. His body, now controlled by something inhuman, knocked the detonator away from his hands. Dmitri felt darkness envelop him as his own mind crumbled. He knew he was lost. Dmitri disappeared that night, as did many others before him. The laboratory was sealed and all official records of the experiment were destroyed. But what was released in that chamber would never be contained again. Weeks later, other reports began to emerge. Scientists, soldiers, and even civilians in several countries began to suffer from inexplicable insomnia. They described the same whispers Dmitri had heard, the same disturbing visions. The entity was spreading, finding new hosts across the world. The prisoners in the Russian sleep experiment had told the truth. They were no longer human. They were the beginning of something bigger. And now, what had started in the depths of a Soviet laboratory was spreading across the planet. No one was safer.